minute more for attendees to trickle in. So take another minute or two, and then we'll get started. All right, well, we will go ahead and get started. Welcome to the National Association of Scholars ongoing webinar series on the great American novel. Today, our topic is Raymond Chandler's The Big Sleep. My name is John Seiler. I'm a fellow at the National Association of Scholars, and I'll be moderating today's event. In just a minute, you'll hear from our panelists, but first I want to give you an idea of what to expect from today's event. After I introduce our speakers, they will each have 12 to 15 minutes to speak. At the conclusion of their remarks, I will read questions from you, the audience, to our panelists. Please feel free to submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen during the event. And panelists, I'll note that it's always great to have a kind of free-flowing discussion. So if you have questions for one another, feel free to chime in. Audience members, if your questions do not get answered, you can send them to me at contact@nas.org, and I will forward them to the panelists. This event will be recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to the email address you used to register. So thank you very much for joining us for this event, and without further ado, I will introduce our distinguished speakers for today. Otto Penzler is the president and CEO of MysteriousPress.com and the proprietor of the Mysterious Bookshop in New York City. He was the publisher of The Armchair Detective, the Edgar-winning quarterly journal devoted to the study of mystery and suspense fiction for 17 years. He also created the publishing firm of Otto Penzler Books and the Armchair Detective Library. Penzler is a prolific editor, and his most recent anthologies include the Big Book of Espionage Stories, the Big Book of Real Murders, the Big Book of Female Detectives, the Big Book of Sherlock Holmes Stories, and the Best American Noir of the Century with James Ellroy. Dr. Sean McCann is Kenan Professor of the Humanities at Wesleyan University. He is the author of A Pinnacle of Feeling, American Literature and the Presidential Government, and Gunshoe America, Hard-Boiled Crime Fiction and the Rise and Fall of New Deal Liberalism, which received honorable mention for the American Studies Association's John Hopkins Franklin Prize for the best book in American Studies. His essays have appeared in American Quarterly, The Common Review, ELH, Radical History Review, 20th Century Literature, Studies in American Fiction, and the Yale Journal of Criticism, and several edited volumes. Finally, Dr. Leonard Cassuto is Professor of Literature at Fordham University. He is the author or editor of 9 books on American literature and culture, most recently, The New PhD, How to Build a Better Graduate Education, and The Graduate School Mess, What Caused It and How We Can Fix It. Other recent books include The Cambridge History of the American Novel, The Cambridge Companion to Baseball, and Hard-Boiled Sentimentality, The Secret History of American Crime Stories. So without further ado, I'll ask Otto to start us off with his presentation.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'll talk a little bit about Raymond Chandler. I assume that you're well read, and so you know who Raymond Chandler is. He is essentially the quintessential American hard-boiled private eye writer, and has that reputation for a very long time and well-deserved. He, although people have often commented on the fact that he spent a great deal of time in England and brought some of the British concept of chivalry and knighthood with him after his studies in England. Fact is, he was born in America. He was born in Chicago and raised for his very early years in Nebraska, making him a real Midwestern boy, and then went to England, where he went to Dulwich College and came back to America in 1912. He was born in 1888 and came back to America in 1912. He served in World War I with the Canadian Army, and then came back in 1919 after the war and settled in Los Angeles, which is where he then spent most of his life. He was not a happy person. He was apparently a difficult person to get along with. He had unusual and limited relationships with women until he met Sissy, the woman that he wound up marrying. She was 15 years older than he was, but apparently he was devoted to her in spite of the fact that he cheated on her with alarming regularity. He had various jobs, including for an oil. He was an executive at an oil company, which did not suit him in the least. But that's the job that he had, that he needed, and then got fired during the Depression in 1932, when he was 44 years old. So here's a 44-year-old unemployed person in the middle of the Depression. He didn't really know what to do. So he looked at the concept of writing. He had been writing reviews and some essays and poetry without remunerative success, although some people praised his reviews in particular. So he was looking for a way to earn a living at writing, and saw that the newsstands had about 500 different pulp magazines available. So he bought some and read them, and he thought, I can do that. And so he set out to write for the Pulps. Now, the Pulps were called Pulps because of the cheap paper on which they were printed, which is pulp paper, and it was very inexpensive, and the magazines were priced accordingly. They were 10 cents, they were 15 cents. The best of them in time became as much as 25 cents. So they were very cheap, but they were printed in huge, huge numbers. It was a basic form of entertainment for a vast majority of readers in America. More of them were aimed at men than at women or young readers. And so the most popular became magazines of crime fiction and science fiction and fantasy and horror fiction. But crime fiction ruled. And the magazine that ruled above all the others was Black Mask. Black Mask was founded in 1920 by a couple of people who had a literary journal that wasn't making any money. And so they thought they would make some money by starting a pulp magazine, Black Mask. And it lasted until 1950. It started out, Black Mask did, as a magazine of adventure, Western, mysteries, and any kind of exciting story that would appeal to a mass readership. But it turned out that the mysteries were far and away the most successful element. And so it became essentially a mystery magazine in its very early years. It is credited, rightly, it seems to me, for having produced the first private eye novel by a writer named Carol John Daly, who then wrote a second crime novel, and then wrote another story about the same character, and therefore is credited with creating the first series private detective in the hard-boiled world. Dashiell Hammett then picked up the notion of becoming a mystery writer. He had written for a variety of other magazines, but turned to the Pulps as well, because you could make a living at the Pulps even though they paid 1 penny a word. And so most of the writers who worked for the Pulps wrote a lot. It was not uncommon for writers to write 1 million or 1.5 million or even 2 million words a year so that they could make a living. So Hammett took the private eye form and brought it into the world of literature. He was so much more talented than the hack, Carol John Daly, and most of the other writers who were also hacks. And Hammett really became the first great American hard-boiled writer. And Chandler read him, and he read Earl Stanley Gardner. And for one of his stories, he took an Earl Stanley Gardner story, broke it down to its elements, and then rewrote it in his own style. And his style was really the great breakout. He was a stylist more than a storyteller. The style was just absolutely laden with metaphor and simile in a way that the mystery world had never seen before. He wrote a series of novellas using various private eyes, which he then decided at some point that he was going to try his hand at a novel. And the novel became The Big Sleep, his first novel. And the way he wrote the novel was by pulling together two of the novellas, Killer in the Rain and The Curtain, and blending them along with little bits and pieces from two other stories to make a somewhat convoluted plot, which The Big Sleep is. But he did a lot of rewriting, fine-tuning, and making it the beautiful work that it is. And the Philip Marlowe character that he created became kind of the everyman that readers identified with and loved. He was an idealist. He was described by Chandler as a knight, somebody who walks the mean streets without being mean himself. But he was also cynical, but he also was funny. He had great wit. These stories he told, Chandler told these stories through Marlowe in the first person. So here's Marlowe, a blue collar guy, sometimes calling on wealthy people who he despised most of the time. And American readers identified with the Philip Marlowe character and came to love him. It's one of the reasons why he has remained in print ever since the first book came out. It has never gone out of print for one moment. 80 years later, he's still being read, and for fun, as well as being taught in universities. The Big Sleep also was the basis for a film, a very popular film, made in 1946 with Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall. It was directed by Howard Hawks with a screenplay by a cast of thousands, it seems. But the ones who got screen credit were Jules Furman, William Faulkner, but mainly Lee Brackett. And the plot of the film was even more convoluted than the plot of the book. And at one point, and this story is told in several different ways, but I'll tell you the way that I know it. One of the actors approached Howard Hawks and said, the chauffeur, he was murdered, but who murdered him? And Hawks looked at the screenplay and says, geez, I don't know. We better ask Chandler. So they wired Chandler, and said, "Who killed the chauffeur?" And they got a wire back from Chandler saying, "The butler did it." And there was no butler in the film or the book. So that's my allotted 13 minutes. So I will turn it over to Sean.
Thank you, Otto, and thank you all for being here. I'm so happy to be in this session, to be with such esteemed colleagues. And I'm gonna probably echo a lot of what Otto said and try and put it in a little bit in my own words. And to do that, I'm gonna share my screen and show some slides. So give me 1 second here. Sorry, it'll take me a minute to get this going. Okay, so here's my view of the Big Sleep in general, I guess, which I think is a great, whoops, I'm sorry. I think of as becoming a great American novel as the result of a happy accident occurring to a very unhappy man, and I would echo Otto's estimation in that respect. When Chandler began writing the stories that would become the Big Sleep, as Otto points out, he was at the nadir of what looked like a disastrous career. He had had a very successful career in the oil boom of Los Angeles in the 1920s, working for the Dabney Oil Syndicate. He was getting paid the equivalent of $650,000 a year at one point, but he was a terrible drunk with really erratic habits who seemed to be getting increasingly disastrous in his behavior. So as Otto says, he was fired in 1932 at the very depth of the Great Depression. And he was a person in some very difficult circumstances at that point, I think. As Otto mentioned, he's 1944, he's 44 at this point. And he looks like a very lonely man with few friends, few connections left, a very difficult personality. He's married to a woman who is 17 years his senior, although, as Otto says, that marriage did not look like it was always very close, although Chandler was indeed dedicated to her, and apparently increasingly so. At this point in their lives, they have moved from Los Angeles to Santa Monica to take advantage of the cheaper rents there. But Chandler's experience as a drinker in Los Angeles during the Prohibition era and his experience living in Santa Monica had given him a lot of experience of some of the uglier sides of the city in this era. In any case, as Otto says, he begins an apprenticeship in the pulp magazines, and here you can see the famous Black Mask magazine, where Chandler began writing his stories imitating Earl Stanley Gardner and to a certain extent Dashiell Hammett, and developing the extraordinary style that he did. And where did this style come from? I think it's the confluence of his personal history and that existing form in the pulp magazines and the demand of turning out material for them, which Chandler did for a period of 5 or 6 years before he got his opportunity with Knopf and published The Big Sleep. In his youth, when he was an aspiring poet and critic in Edwardian London, he wrote late romantic poetry, what he himself called grade B Georgian. The burden of this writing, as he put it, was to bring together realism and fairyland. The challenge, as he said, was to write about real things magically. And here we have a pretty good sample of this. Stay with me, love, in the city's murk, where the sun but dares shyly to lurk, and we will watch life hand in hand like a boy and girl in a grown-up land. And I think by everybody's estimation, including Chandler's, this was dreck. So it also, as Otto said, did not pay well enough for Chandler to survive as a writer in London. He comes to the United States, back to the United States in 1912, eventually makes his way to Los Angeles, and then will only return to becoming a professional writer again in the 1930s, where in the context of the pulp magazines, he's able to bring back his romantic sensibility, but now in a way that emphasizes not the harmony he sought before, but disharmony. Disharmony, awkwardness, the absence of fit between dream and world, and between style and genre. So here I think you see Chandler as a modernist poet as much as detective writer. This is the famous scene in which Philip Marlow describes the Fullwider building in the Big Sleep, where Harry Jones, the aspiring detective, is going to be killed. The scene is one, of course, of despair and detritus and grotesque decay. The city as nightmare. A single droplight burned beyond an open once gilt elevator. There was a tarnished and well-missed spittoon on a gnawed rubber mat. A case of false teeth hung on the mustard-colored wall like a fuse box on a screen porch. We could continue. There's any number of passages like this, of course, in the Chandler oeuvre, and they tend to emphasize, as this one does, the city as a kind of nightmarish landscape, but also the kind of extraordinary excess of Chandler's style, his intense poetic sensibility in response to a disappointing world. I think this is the core of Chandler's fiction and the core of the Big Sleep. The kind of theme that goes along with this style, which is that it's about loneliness. As Otto says, Hammett had shown that you could do extraordinarily sophisticated things with the hardboiled detective story in his work earlier, but it's Chandler who really makes the genre what it becomes, I believe, and who makes it about Weltschmerz, that the world is sad, the detective is sad. The big story of the Big Sleep, I think, is Rusty Regan is dead. Rusty Regan is dead. He's gone. The city without him is a lost place. So there's any number of passages like this in the Big Sleep that show us what I think of as the dead city. The first paragraph here describes, is Marlow describing his office. And again, the kind of scene that you get often in Chandler's work, which, as I say, is, from my point of view, just about loneliness in a lonely street, as Chandler later would describe Marlow in The Little Sister. There was a gusty wind blowing in at the windows, and the soot from the oil burners of the hotel next door was downdrafted into the room and rolling across the top of the desk like a tumbleweed drifting across a vacant lot. And then the scene of where Rusty has been murdered, where Marlow himself will nearly be murdered by young Carmen Sturwood. The wells were no longer pumping. There was a pile of rusted pipe, a loading platform that sagged at one end, half a dozen empty oil drums lying in a ragged pile. There was the stagnant oil-scummed water of an old sump iridescent in the sunlight. So you see here, I think, Chandler kind of rising stylistically to the thing that inspires him most, which is something like despair and disgust at a landscape that has been stripped of beauty and meaning. And that, in the context of the 1930s, I think, was the material for a potent political myth. It was a lyric myth, a kind of romantic vision of the city, but it was also a story about what was wrong with America in the 1930s. And I would describe that by saying that for Chandler, what's wrong is the absence of fellowship. That Rusty Regan has gone, and what Rusty represents for Marlow and for General Sternwood and for General Sternwood's butler, Norris, that's all gone. So here's the scene where Marlow is talking to Norris, the butler, and asking what it was about Rusty Regan that mattered to General Sternwood. And the answer is something like fellowship, I think. What did this Regan fellow have that bored into him so? The butler looked at me levelly, and yet with a clear lack of expression. Youth, sir, he said, and the soldier's eye. Like yours, I said. If I may say so, sir, not unlike yours. So here, of course, Norris and Marlow are recognizing each other as fellows, seeing something in common between themselves and General Sternwood and Rusty Regan. And the larger story of the Big Sleep and of Chandler's fiction in general is that world is gone. That world is gone because in its place is a world where the rich prey on the working man. And the inverse of this image of fellowship is what we see in the beginning of the novel and what we get hinted at in the conclusion, which is an image, I think, of the wealthy as sexual predators. The Sternwood family represent the rich in this novel, and they are predatory. They're extractive economically, and they're sexually predatory. Carmen is the killer in the story. Vivian is her ally. And the general, I think, if you look carefully at Chandler's prose, plays a comparable role. So here is the famous scene where we see the general in his greenhouse and surrounded by his orchids in this image of decadent luxury. And we get this extraordinary description where the general speaks slowly, using his strength as carefully as an out-of-work showgirl uses her last good pair of stockings. Orchids are nasty things, he says. Their flesh is too much like the flesh of men, and their perfume has the rotten sweetness of a prostitute. Marlow stares at the general open-mouthed, and shortly after this will say, "You must have liked Rusty Regan," I said. "He was the breath of life to me while they lasted," replies the general. So the intimation about this, I think, is that from Marlow's point of view, the rich are sexual predators on the common man. They deny the chance for fellowship in a decent world. And that, in the context of the Depression and the New Deal, is a potent political myth, as I say, and one that will endure because of its poetic resonance. But to find out more about that, you must purchase and read my book. Thank you.
Let's see here. Okay, thanks, Sean. I'm going to also share my screen. All right, so I'm going to also make gestures back to some of the points that Sean and Otto have made. We're talking about the literary greatness of the Big Sleep, and one of the things that struck me when we were invited to this panel is that literary greatness is easiest to defend after the fact. It's a label that books typically get bestowed on, that it's bestowed on books after they have already sold well upon the occasion of their publication. That is, most of the books that we call great were good or excellent sellers in their own time. Now, at his peak, Raymond Chandler transcended the crime genre that he wrote in. He was praised to the skies by critics. He was admired and imitated by his crime writing peers. He was avidly read by the general public. But no one would have ever predicted that for Chandler during the early years of his career. Chandler started out as a very hot prospect, but the sales of his early books discouraged both him and especially his publisher. And how that got turned around is its own kind of mystery story. And this is the title that I've given it. And I'm now going to tell it very briefly. Here, we've already heard about the pulp magazines from both Sean and Otto. I want to dwell on this image only long enough for you to notice how lurid it is, because we will have a way to contrast that to the way that the covers of his hardcover books looked. Now, Sean and Otto both talked about Chandler's career in the pulps. You know, it was for working writers who worked very hard indeed for not very much money. And the pulps, as you can see from this image, they're very lowbrow. The intervention of Alfred A. Knopf in the development of hard-boiled fiction in the late 1920s is an event that both interfered with this lowbrow progression, and it's also an event whose importance is really very hard to overstate when we look back at the history of crime fiction in the United States. Because Knopf was, even in his early years, one of the most famous book publishers in the country at the time. And we look back at him now, he's one of the most important book publishers of the 20th century. This is Alfred A. Knopf. He started his own publishing house in 1915 while he was still in his 20s. And by 1925, which is around the time that he was getting the idea that he should start publishing hardboiled crime fiction, he was already worshipped both in and out of the trade. His employees used to call him Lord Alfred. So the Knopf imprint was by the mid 1920s, it was already synonymous with intellectual quality and high prestige, and it remains so, even though it's been purchased and it's now a wholly owned subdivision. So as Otto said, Knopf first signed Dashiell Hammett, who came out of the Black Mask School, and he also signed James M. Cain, whose first novel, The Postman Always Rings Twice, brought a lot of good publicity to Knopf because it got involved in a minor controversy over its sexual content that led to it being briefly banned in Boston. That book came out in 1934. So when Knopf decided to publish Raymond Chandler in 1938, hardboiled writing had already, thanks to him, gained some cachet, but it was certainly not highbrow literature. Knopf believed that Chandler would continue the march of the hard-boiled towards literary respectability. He thought that with Chandler, he had found the next star of hard-boiled fiction. So he tried to take Chandler right to Broadway, as it were. He announced the coming publication of The Big Sleep with a full-page advertisement in Publishers Weekly, the influential, still influential magazine of the trade. The text of the ad was very short. This is what it said. In 1929, Dashiell Hammett. In 1934, James M. Cain. In 1939, Raymond Chandler. Now, The Big Sleep came out shortly afterwards. Sean showed you this cover very briefly. I want to bring you back to it to contrast with the pulp covers. Look how restrained this is. There's certainly a suggestion of a stream of blood, but this is lacking all of the bodice ripping and the thugs with guns. This is very sort of well-mannered. And it suggests the desire to be taken seriously, which is something that Chandler very much wanted. He wanted to be taken seriously as more than a mystery writer. You saw that Sean showed you how he started out as a poet. Chandler wanted to be taken seriously as a novelist in some of the same ways that Philip Marlowe wants to be taken seriously as something more than a detective. Throughout The Big Sleep, Marlowe has a simultaneous love of nobility and a hatred of pretension. And he's vexed because nobility and pretension go together a lot of the time. So you might say that Marlowe has a high-low problem. Chandler, in some ways, does too. One of the very few reviewers who noticed The Big Sleep at all described it as depraved. And the description hurt Chandler's feelings because he saw what he was doing in a very different way. Now, The Big Sleep is a grimy story, and that description of the Fullwider building that Sean read to us from, Sean is also showing very good manners because he deleted from the description the Chandler's description of a used condom that is also on the floor of the Fullwider building. So the depravity, you could see where a critic might get there. But as Sean also says, The Big Sleep is also in its own way a parable of loyalty and lost friendship. And Marlowe's conflicted humanism, you might say, rather than any burning desire to find out who killed whom. Here we can go back to Otto's point about the chauffeur. Hard to find out who killed him, if anybody. What's more important is Marlowe's humanism. That's what drives The Big Sleep and really everything that Chandler wrote forward. Now, the Big Sleep sold over 10,000 copies when it was first released as a Knopf front list title at a cover price of $2, which is about the equivalent of about $30 today. The English sales it were proportionally higher because there were more libraries per capita in England. That brought the total to about 18,000. Chandler's royalty rate was 20% of the wholesale price for the first 5,000 units and 25% afterwards. And the Grosset and Dunlap brought out a discount $1 edition in paperback that sold another 3,500. Chandler got a 5% royalty for that. Altogether, Chandler earned about $2,000 for the Big Sleep, which was not enough to keep him from living pen to mouth. These sales figures were very respectable for a mystery novel, but they didn't add up to the kind of crossover appeal that Knopf and Chandler were both hoping for. And a particular problem was the lack of reviews. The Chandler only saw 4, and only one of those 4 was favorable. So Knopf was known for his patience and his loyalty in his dealings with his authors, and he still believed in Chandler. And one notable proof of that was his refusal to sell Chandler's novels to the cheap paperback industry that was emerging at that time. These cheap paperbacks were known as pulp books after the Pulp Fiction forebears, and they paid just 3% in royalties. More important, getting sold to the paperbacks amounted to a one-way ticket to a ghetto, a genre ghetto, because an author who published right to paperback had no hope of being taken seriously, no hope of being reviewed. It was a lower tier career path, and you had no alternative if you want to be a writer than to continue in that path forever afterwards. And Chandler worked way too slowly to be able to make a good living pumping out paperback fiction, and he wanted very badly to be taken seriously. So for him, that paperback route was no viable path at all. He published his second novel, Farewell, My Lovely, in 1940. It sold fewer copies than The Big Sleep did, 11,000 in the US and another 4,000 in the UK. Now, crime literature was doing very well in the 1940s in general. The average hardback novel, crime novel, sold about 3,000 copies in the United States. So Chandler was doing better than average, but not better enough. The main problem was, again, the lack of reviews. Without reviews, he couldn't make the leap to the wider readership and also the higher prestige level that he and Knopf were both seeking for him. So Knopf spent very heavily to promote Chandler's third novel, The High Window. But the results didn't look good. Chandler's American sales figures continued to drop to 10,000 copies, although the novel did sell respectably in Great Britain. And in 1943, shortly before Chandler's fourth novel, The Lady in the Lake, was set to appear, Knopf gave up on Chandler. He licensed The Big Sleep to come out as a cheap paperback. So looks bad for Chandler here, but then something very unexpected happened. The Avon paperback edition of The Big Sleep sold 300,000 copies almost right away. An armed services paperback edition of the novel, which was published the same year and given away to American soldiers in World War II, sold an additional 150,000 copies. So Chandler suddenly became visible. The armed services editions, by the way, you see that on the right, they were sized exactly to fit in the pockets of combat fatigues. The armed services editions amounted to about 120 million books, ranging from highbrow classics like Thackeray to popular fiction. So Chandler's prestige factor was hard to determine in that group. He was on the one hand a Knopf author, but he was also a paperback writer. No one got rich off the armed services editions. They were a low profit venture that was run by a consortium of publishing executives, and they paid royalties of 1 cent per copy, split between author and publisher. But the exposure was wonderful for Chandler, and the visibility that he got translated very quickly into further success. The Lady in the Lake got more reviews than any previous Chandler novel, mostly favorable ones, and Chandler's sales totals also went up. The Lady in the Lake sold 14,000 copies in the United States, plus another 13,000 in Great Britain. And these paybacks earned Chandler entry into a new market because Billy Wilder invited him to collaborate on the screenplay of James Cain's novel, Double Indemnity. And that screenplay was nominated for an Oscar, and the movie was nominated for Best Picture. So Chandler's star continues to rise. The success of Double Indemnity led to further film adaptations of Chandler's own novels. Murder, My Sweet, which was a version of Farewell, My Lovely, was both a critical and popular success. And The Big Sleep, as Otto has already said, cast Humphrey Bogart as Philip Marlowe, which was a choice that Chandler had been cheerleading for before it happened, because he described Bogart as someone who could be tough without a gun. So these movies created a feedback loop. They led to even more reviews of Chandler's books, more paperback sales of the earlier books, and more film adaptations. And Chandler was enriched in all kinds of ways. Of course, he got wealthy, but he also became prestigious in a way that he had been imagining all along. He went from a writer who a decade earlier was trying to avoid being seen as a hack. Now he was being seen as a literary artist. When his fifth novel, The Little Sister, appeared after World War II in 1949, Evelyn Waugh, who was at that time a taste-making British author and critic, Waugh called Chandler the best writer in America. Period, full stop. Not the best mystery writer. So that first paperback edition of The Big Sleep is the key link in this whole chain. Chandler might have been building up loyal reader support before that, but the success of that book, which Chandler called a 2-bit edition, was the catalyst that turned his career into what we recognize afterwards. So why did The Big Sleep succeed so dramatically as a paperback after the hardback sales had been so disappointing, and also Chandler's succeeding books the same? And so I'm not going to give you a very technical answer that's grounded in years of study of crime novels and of book history. You see some of this here. My answer to this question is, who the hell knows? That's the alchemy of the book business. Why Chandler? Why then? We can only speculate. So Chandler had a big influence on the writers who followed him in his own time and also in ours. And it's entirely appropriate that he's still in print in both the vintage Black Lizard crime series, and which reprints old genre fiction, and also the Library of America, which is the unofficial canon of American literature. So I will finish up by saying that Chandler's career in this highly varied market saga shows the range of possibilities for a crime writer in America. And it's a range that Chandler both sought, because he liked the high and the low in different ways, and also chafed under. He both defined it and he exemplified it. And as this last image shows, this division continues to govern both his literary life and now his literary afterlife.
Thank you so much, Leonard, and thank you to all our panelists. So now we're going to have a little discussion based on the presentations that were just given, and based on the questions that audience members have. So audience members, at this point, feel free to type your questions in the chat and in the or in the Q&A box. But as usual, when I'm running these webinars, I have a few questions of my own. The first was going to be the question that Leonard answered at the end of his talk. So, I will bear that in mind, that we don't know the exact reason for the success of the paperback edition. But I'm interested in perhaps each panelist talking a little bit about the influence of this novel, the influence of the Big Sleep, and ways in which it's sort of reflected in American literature since its time, or in American pop culture more broadly. So if anyone wants to take a stab at that, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say.
Sure. First, I would disagree with Leonard a little bit about calling 10,000 or 12,000 hardcover copies a failure. That's not true. The average crime novel in the 30s and 40s was about 3,000 copies. So Chandler was selling 3 times as many as or more than the average writer, and indeed sold double what Dashiell Hammett was selling of the books that he brought from the pages of Black Mask. Obviously the Dane Curse and the Maltese Falcon. They had print runs of about 5,000 and 6,000 copies at Knopf, and Chandler had print runs of 10,000 and 12,000, which was pretty successful. And I agree with you that all we can do is speculate about why he became so popular after the mass market paperback. But that's true of many careers. The most famous or the most egregious example being Mickey Spillane. Mickey Spillane's hardcover books at Dutton had hardcover printings of about 3,000 or 4,000 copies, and then the paperbacks wound up selling 10 million. Paperbacks were affordable, so a lot of people could afford to buy a 25-cent paperback, whereas they couldn't afford a $2 book, which, as you said, is the equivalent of $30 today. And $30 is a lot of money today, just as $2 was then. So I think he was more successful than you're giving him credit for.
So in the spirit of productive disagreement, what I would say is that we should look at what Knopf did. That the Knopf went really hard behind Chandler and tried to keep him out of the paperback market, because that's what both he and Chandler wanted for a long time. But eventually he gave up. I would say that with the kind of tailwind that Knopf was giving Chandler, you would expect more than average. But they wanted more. That you based on that full page ad. But certainly you're right that Chandler was invisible in the way that he wanted to be visible. And one of your questions, John, had to do with the influence, and the influence of in the end of what Chandler did is very hard to overestimate. This whole idea, this character of the brooding detective who is who searches for the authors of crimes while trying to maintain whatever semblance of a personal life he has, and trying to keep it all out of public view. So he's turning darkly inward. This is all from Chandler. That the Chandler had legions of imitators in his own time, and that kind of strand of crime and detective fiction is still in the United States and abroad now, the dominant strand, because hardboiled fiction has been one of America's most successful creative exports. And when crime writers
along with jazz,
yes, in England and in Scandinavia and elsewhere, when they pick up the detective character, it's like, their own version of Philip Marlowe. There are numerous examples of this, too many to list, but Mankell is in Sweden is a notable one.
There was a progression of hard-boiled writers of really very, very high quality that went from Hammett to Chandler to Ross MacDonald, who basically pastiched Chandler's work in his earliest books until he found his own voice. And then Robert B. Parker, who wrote his doctoral thesis on Hammett and Chandler, and then basically worshipped Ross MacDonald because of the way he was so similar to Chandler, who we also love. So that is just the beginning. I mean, as you say, pretty much everybody. But what's important is some of the really great writers, not just good storytellers, but the great writers of hard-boiled fiction really came from Philip Marlowe. Although I will say that Sam Spade was kind of similar to Marlowe before Marlowe came around. There was certainly an influence there.
I'm just going to echo, I think both Lenny and Otto. I agree that Sam Spade precedes Philip Marlowe for sure, but I do think that what Chandler brings to the genre that helps to explain his extraordinary influence is, I think in keeping with what Lenny says, I'll repeat what I said earlier. He makes it a psychological literature, I think, and he makes it about loneliness. That it's sad to be a detective, and that is a very powerful story. As Lenny says, it has great legs. But personally, I just want to say that I've never thought it was a great mystery who killed Owen Taylor, and I thought Chandler was being coy by not answering the question. I think the novel makes it pretty clear that Owen Taylor commits suicide because he's terribly sad about Carmen Sternwood, and Owen Taylor killed Geiger, and that's just a symptom of the nastiness of the world.
An audience member.
I think that was less than clear in the screenplay.
Nobody explains it in the screenplay at all. The screenplay doesn't make a lot of sense. But the novel, interestingly, I think there's a moment in the novel where the crime is deciphered, where Marlowe is standing with Bernie Oles on the dock as the car is drawn up, and the diver there explains the entire thing. And Bernie Oles says, "You got good eyes." And so you see, the cop and the Marlowe and the diver, they all understand each other. They're the good fellowship. And they all know, yeah, the guy kills himself because he can't handle the fact that his girlfriend got naked in front of a photographer. Because it's about dames.
Probably Chandler was drunk when he got the message.
I think so, yeah. Yeah. And I think he enjoyed taking the piss too.
Yeah.
So related to this, one audience member, James Mueller, asks, how would the various presenters rate the film versions of Chandler's books as opposed to the books themselves?
I can go first very quickly. I think the Big Sleep with Bogart was terrific. Of course, Philip Marlowe, we all think of him now as Bogart, but then we also think of him as Sam Spade. So he played the same character in both films. He's Humphrey Bogart rather than Philip Marlowe or Sam Spade. The Robert Mitchum version from 1978, I'm guessing?
75.
75. I think was too old for the part, although I'm a huge Mitchum fan, and I think he would made a great Marlowe, but not close to what Chandler was trying to portray in the books, where Marlowe was probably 40 years old and Mitchum was probably 60 at the time. But a good film, not a great film.
I love that Mitchum, actually, but
a lot of people do.
I thought that he got a lot of it. That a lot of it is just right. And Marlowe is an old soul, and so the idea that Mitchum was physically older doesn't make the lines any less appropriate to me.
I would argue that.
But there are some other good versions that that we haven't mentioned. I can mention them, but
you sound like you want to.
Well, I mean, I was seeing if Sean wanted to weigh in there. But that Dick Powell version of Farewell My Lovely, I enjoyed that very much.
Oh.
And the one which is all that cinematic experiment, the all point of view, that's I forget the name of that one, where you're always seeing through Marlowe's eyes, so you never
The High Window, which was also called the Brasher doubloon.
Yeah, but
Right.
I'd like to see more more adaptations. But the Long Goodbye that Altman made is an interesting movie, although I don't think it has all that much to do with Chandler's book. But
I hate that movie beyond words. But Michael Connelly swears it's the best adaptation of Raymond Chandler ever done. Elliot Gould as Philip Marlowe is a disgrace.
I think that Michael Connelly loves The Long Goodbye above all Chandler books, and that is, I think, one reason he might think so. One of Michael Connelly's novels is a thinly veiled rewrite of The Long Goodbye. We're talking about Chandler's long tail that Connelly loves, whose Harry Bosch is in so many ways a knockoff from Philip Marlowe, actually has a novel whose plot is an updated mirror of The Long Goodbye. So this just another way that we see Chandler in the crime fiction of the present.
Although Bosch is a cop rather than a private eye, so he actually has an income,
Yes.
which Marlowe didn't always have.
Yeah, though somehow between the 40s novels and The Long Goodbye, Chandler upgrades, Marlowe upgrades from an apartment to a house. So he must have been doing okay.
I guess so.
It's not clear how he maintains that, since he's always giving the money back.
Yes. Yeah, like Spencer, who, as you noted, Otto, is a virtual knockoff of Chandler in many ways, at least, especially the dialogue. Spencer is much happier than Marlowe.
Which title did you say? I'm sorry.
Robert Parker's Spencer. Is the Parker loved Chandler's dialogue, and so he sought to duplicate it in every book. But Spencer is much happier than Marlowe.
Yeah, and he's got a regular girlfriend who, for the first 15 books, I was hoping would be mugged and murdered as soon as possible because she was such a royal pain in the butt. But it turns out to be good for him, and of course, he had a pretty good sidekick in Hawk. So they're somewhat different, but he did like the wit that Chandler brought to Marlowe. I love that series. I love the Spencer series.
A somewhat related question. I imagine some of our audience members are not all that familiar with Chandler's work. Kathy asks, which is your favorite Chandler novel and why? I might kind of add on to that, just asking if some of our audience members are just starting out, how would you recommend they get started on Chandler's novels?
I would always recommend. This is a question that comes up in my bookshop on a very regular basis, and I always recommend the first book in a series. You get introduced to the character, and you get to know the character, and then you can read ideally sequentially, chronologically, and you get to see the development of that character, which is a great way to get to know somebody.
So I would say as well, that Chandler and Hammett were both very self-conscious about imagining their literary careers starting when they appeared between hardcovers. Yeah. That is, both of them started out writing short stories for Black Mask. Neither of them collected those stories in their lifetime. It's as though they didn't want their audiences to find those. They wanted them to start with the novels. And the Big Sleep is a very self-conscious debut. The first paragraph of the Big Sleep has Marlowe dressing up to go out. He says, I'm going to call on $4 million, by which he means General Sternwood, and he's putting on his best suit and making sure that he's looking his best, because that's Marlow and Chandler walking out the door, introducing themselves to you, the reader,
No.
in an explicit debut. And so the Chandler, I think, is writing The Big Sleep in a way that he wants you to meet Marlow in this way. I mean, that being said, you could read you could read the Farewell, My Lovely out of order with The Big Sleep. It wouldn't be a tragedy, but Chandler is asking you to begin there in as explicit and obvious a way as he can. My favorite, though, is Farewell, My Lovely. Sorry, Sean.
I second you. I recommend Farewell, My Lovely highly because I think it's the most tightly constructed of the novels and the most poetic. And I think the poetry is the big selling point of the fiction. But I also think that Farewell, My Lovely shares with The Big Sleep and with all of Chandler's fiction a kind of nasty misogyny and homophobia. But in Farewell, My Lovely, it's a little bit less mean, I guess. The misogyny in The Big Sleep is really quite harsh. There's a real nasty edge to it. And at least in Farewell, My Lovely, there's a kind of poetic justification that's a little bit less ugly, I think.
Yeah, and if you're starting, don't start with The Long Goodbye, which is a very ambitious novel, but really best understood in the context of having already knowing Marlow a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's his best book for me. But again, you're quite right. You should be reading them in sequence. He only wrote 7 novels, including Playback, his last book, which I would not recommend you read until you've read the other 6.
And it's not because it's the best.
No. It's because you'll never want to read them again. So read the others first.
Yeah, he wrote Playback from the bottom of a bottle.
And it's evident, yeah. And he left a couple of chapters of a book called Poodle Springs, which an enterprising publisher, Putnam, got Robert B. Parker to continue and write the rest of the book. And one reviewer said, you couldn't really tell when Chandler's part ended and when Parker's part began, which does credit to neither of them.
Well, it looks like we don't have any other audience questions. Do any of the panelists have just kind of questions or side comments before we go into some closing remarks? And I'll, of course, remind the audience that if you have any last minute questions, feel free. This is a time to continue a discussion, so you're welcome to add them now.
I have a couple of very quick things. Both of you showed a fantastic copy of The Big Sleep. Are those your copies, or did you get that off the internet or something?
I don't have an extra $30,000 to get a.
Okay, I was going to make you an offer for the book if it was yours. I just wanted to say one thing about Leonard's point, which was so true about Knopf having a lot of confidence and faith in Chandler from the jump. The advanced proof copy, the galley of The Big Sleep, on the cover said, in 1929, we gave you the Maltese Falcon. In 1934, we gave you The Postman Always Rings Twice. In 1939, we give you The Big Sleep. So he was comparing them to 2 of the books that had great success for Knopf and that were lauded by critics almost immediately. So that's just because I once owned the advanced proof copy. And it really was a way of underlining how much faith Knopf had in him.
So I guess you sold that for a healthy price. Can you talk a little bit about the collector's market for Chandler, Otto?
Sure, I can. It's a very healthy market. Hammett and Chandler both first editions bring a lot of money. Signed copies bring more, and copies in the condition of the Big Sleep that you showed and the Farewell, My Lovely that Leonard showed are extremely valuable. And you're pretty close, Sean, when you said 30,000 for a copy of the Big Sleep like that. Actually, probably be a little bit more because it's so pristine. But yeah, a lot of people want to collect Chandler, but you really can't unless you have quite a lot of money. And the same is true for Hammett. So yes, it's an aggressive market, but a lot of people settle for books in worn dust jackets or no dust jackets, or they'll settle for Grosset and Dunlap reprints. Oh, and by the way, Leonard, you called it Grosset and Dunlap Big Sleep paperback. It wasn't. They don't publish paperbacks. They were 99-cent hardcovers.
Mea culpa. I said something ran away. Oh yeah, do people collect the Armed Services editions?
Yeah, there are people who not necessarily in the mystery world, but people who collect paperbacks. I think the Armed Services editions are very desirable for collectors because they're so different. They're oblong instead of landscape, instead of portrait shape. They're landscape shape. So yeah, I think they're very collected. It's not my field, so I don't know much about it, but I think they are. If I ever get them, they sell very quickly.
Right, and who buys them? Do you get to know your customers for these high ticket items?
Oh, I know my customers very well. I've been in business for 43 years, and a lot of my customers have been customers for virtually all of that time. So I know what they like and why they like it. The customers are really across a very broad spectrum. Fewer women than men, but I think that's true in general. I think men are more prone to be collectors than women. I'll probably get lots of hate mail for saying something as generic as that, but it's true. It's certainly true of collectors in mystery fiction. But there are young people, who start collecting Sherlock Holmes, not first editions, but nice editions, and they work their way up as they earn more money. There are people with serious wealth by the great highlights. The best books are the most famous books by the best authors and the most famous authors. Highlights are generally either the great novels of their time or books frequently that have had great films, really successful films made from their books. So it's a very broad spectrum. I can't really identify my customer solely as one kind of person, but mainly they tend to be male and somewhere between like 25 and 100 years old, like me.
So an audience member asked, what is the origin of the term hard-boiled describing fiction?
Somebody else want to do this?
Sean, you want to do this one?
My recollection is that it's disputed and there's no single etymology for it. It appears as early as the 1920s, if I recall correctly. And I think it's said to have a number of different origins. It seems to be one of those words that people immediately understand the kind of broad meaning of, but that nobody can identify a single author for.
Yeah, I think it was the first usage that I remember, and I could easily be wrong about this, was that it was something as tough as a 10-minute hard-boiled egg.
And there's and it gets used. Hemingway uses it in The Sun Also Rises,
Right.
But yeah, it's my recollection's the same, that no exact source, but general sense of when it comes around. But
Let's check the OED and see if it has origins. Hemingway was Chandler's hero. He was the writer that he most admired, but he had a lot of good things to say about Hammett as well, particularly because Hammett influenced Hemingway and his style so much that Chandler spoke highly of both of them.
A lot of the hard-boiled writers in that first generation were treated Hemingway as though he were radioactive in public, because nobody wanted to admit that he could have influenced them, and so it's very hard to get a sense of truth out of this. That Cain, it's hard to imagine Cain not reading Hemingway, and yet Cain insisted that he never did. All of which means to me that we can't really trust what Cain's saying about everything, about his own origins as a writer of fiction. But the pulp magazines and Hemingway are developing at about the same time, and it's clear that they have some separate development. But it's also clear that once Hemingway becomes famous, Hemingway is the most influential stylist of American English in the 20th century, possibly in history of any single person.
Yeah, but Hemingway was unknown in America when he was reading the pulps and reading Dashiell Hammett.
Mm-hmm.
He was being published in Paris or in little limited editions, so no Americans knew him.
Yeah, and figuring out how to take what Gertrude Stein was doing and make it more approachable and more mass market.
Yeah.
That we could say Gertrude Stein is the mother of the hard boiled, except that she had intermediaries.
They all also loved Henry James. Hammett and Chandler and Gertrude Stein all loved Henry James.
Yeah.
And Hemingway claimed that he didn't, but I don't believe him. Hugh Kenner writes, I think, very brilliantly on the little noticed affinity between Hemingway and Henry James. And I think it runs straight through to Hammett and Chandler as well. They're all aesthetes.
So there's an interesting question in the chat about the first person narration. I'll read the question if somebody else answers it. Any further comments or thoughts about Chandler's very particular first person narrative style, which is told through Marlow, who is a watcher but not fully trustworthy, an exceptionally close observer of environment and characters. And he also describes what he sees in very precise detail, but rarely, if ever, shares his theory of the case with the reader, which is true of detective fiction in general. It would be very difficult. He plays everything close to the vest, and we learn what he thinks about the mystery, mainly by what he says to other characters. He's always a step ahead of the reader in that we only learn what he thinks about the case when he tells another character what he thinks. In this sense, the narrative style is a reflection and indication of Marlowe's loner persona. He doesn't have a traditional Watson figure with whom he can bounce off his ideas. So what do you guys think of that?
It's largely, I think it's accurate. It's very good observation. Writing in first person is very tricky because the character can only know what he knows. He doesn't know what happens when he's not around, what other people are doing. He only has to find out after the fact. And so it's a great challenge to a detective to do that if the author is playing fair and not letting the character know things that he otherwise couldn't know. But it also gives Chandler an opportunity to be witty because his character can speak to other people in a very funny way, a witty, in a witty way that as a third person or an omniscient author, you might not be able to do without seeming overbearing.
I think that's true. Sorry, just lost you there for a second. I think that's true, and I would just add, and I agree with the question. I think it's an excellent description. I would just add that it's very suited to Chandler's poetic style and the emphasis on sensibility, and it's a neat feature of the first person mode, as Otto says, that you get to have the wit, but also the kind of subjectivity. So in my view, the Chandler narrative is kind of neatly divided into the public world and the private world. The public world is all Marlow's engagement with other characters, which is, as he said, I think, two people snotting each other over a desk. It's always combat, and the dialogue always emphasizes Marlow's wit and his capacity to get the best of virtually everybody. And then there's the inner narrative, which is all about his poetic sensibility, his keen observations of the world around him, and the loneliness that just runs through the whole fiction, I think.
I will say that some of what the questionnaire is pointing to, very astutely, I would say, is true of all detective narrative, that you can't have the detective thinking about who done it for the reader, because it's very hard to run the story. You can tell what the detective is thinking by looking at what he does. Where is he going now? Who is he talking to now? What is he saying to the people? And yes, you get all the observations. You have to trust those. But detective story narration, when it's done first person, has to be coy in that way. Otherwise, you can't maintain a kind of narrative tension that detective fiction requires. But what Chandler gives you, as Sean and Otto are both saying in different ways, is Chandler is showing you the detective as the master of repartee, who is, and that's Chandler's version of what Hammett described Sam Spade as in the introduction to the Modern Library edition of the Maltese Falcon. He said Spade is a dream man, and he defines dream man as somebody who can get the better of everyone he comes into contact with. And so in today's crime fiction, I think the best example of a dream man is Jack Reacher, who is never flummoxed by anything. You know, he might have a gun turned on him, but he's always absolutely calm, and he always knows that he's going to win the encounter in some way eventually. And Sam Spade is also utterly unflappable in this way. Marlow as well, but from Marlow, the expression of this unflappability is wit. And that's in some ways what separates Chandler from the rest of them, because Marlow is so much fun to listen to all the time.
Yeah. You know, one of the things one of the flaws that we have as readers sometimes is we confuse or we make the assumption that the character is an idealized version of the author, that they're so similar that we would know the character if we knew the author, and vice versa. But that's not true in the case of Chandler, who apparently was extremely reticent, rarely engaged in any kind of conversation with anybody if he could avoid it, and was apparently boring when he did speak to people. This has been reported more than once, although not that many people have had that. Not many authors had that much interaction with him. A really nice example or description of that comes from Ross MacDonald and his Lou Archer character. I once published a collection of all of the Lou Archer stories and asked Ross MacDonald to write the introduction and describe and talk more about Lou Archer, and is he a reflection of who you are? And he used the great line, which I think is appropriate for many, many crime writers. He said, "I'm not Archer, but Archer is me." In an idealized version.
He also described Archer as somebody who, if he turns in profile, is paper thin, so you can't see him, because he's not supposed to have depth. He's supposed to navigate the characters and discover their depth. But and Chandler, by the way, called MacDonald repellent, but I think that Chandler was just guarding the territory.
Well, Chandler was getting sick of people emulating his style, and he saw that as taking away from his position, his unique position as the great detective writing man of letters, and he really ripped Ross MacDonald in print, and he accused Chandler of trying to kill him, essentially. If you think that your living writing is being alive, and their feud lasted until Chandler died.
Well, and MacDonald responded by naming Archer after a Hammett character rather than a Chandler character.
I think Chandler also called Kane a Proust in dirty overalls.
Yeah.
Somebody else he hated. Yeah.
Yeah, and who stunk like a billy goat.
Right, exactly.
All right. Well, we're getting around to the time when I'll ask each panelist to give a short closing remark. So before that, I wanted to just say thank you all for joining this National Association of Scholars webinar. Before we proceed to closing remarks, I wanted to take a moment to say that if you enjoyed this webinar, there are several ways that you can help us continue to make them. First, if you're not already a member of the NAS, please join. It really does help us, and you'll get special access to events from the NAS. Second, if you're already a member or if you simply want to go the extra mile, you can donate to the National Association of Scholars. You'll find links in the chat below that will let you learn more. And the third thing is that you can share these videos and these events with others and tell them about the events. After this webinar concludes, we will email the link to the YouTube video so that you can share it far and wide. It's been wonderful to see more people joining these webinars each week, and we want to continue to reach as many people as possible. So with that, I will now turn to our speakers for closing remarks, and we'll go ahead and proceed in the order that the speakers originally spoken. So Otto, go ahead.
Okay, I would like to first of all thank the association for selecting Raymond Chandler in the Big Sleep. I think it speaks well that an organization of literary scholars is recognizing that crime fiction is worthy of being discussed in this group. And I enjoyed my two colleagues and their observations and thank them for being here with me. And thank you for inviting me.
I'll just second all that and say what a pleasure it was to be here and to hear from such brilliant people.
Thanks everybody for having us. I'll say something a little bit different. A few years ago, I read a very interesting history of the foodie movement in America. And it said that the argument was that all of the variegated writing and reading and cooking and eating that is now such a rich culture in the United States is traceable to three people: Julia Child, James Beard, and Craig Claiborne, each in their own different way. I'm not going to go into it. We, the three of us, have been talking in a different way around three other figures. Of course, Chandler, who is the center of our discussion today, but Hammett has come up repeatedly, and James Cain a little bit less often. And those three are like the holy trinity of hard-boiled fiction. And like the three food writers have if they're the trunk, you follow the trunk up and it branches outward to an enormous tree. This is true in American food culture. It's also true in American hard-boiled fiction, which from the beginnings by Chandler, Cain, and Hammett is a really enormous and tremendously varied and really rewarding tree. to read your way out along. And as we said earlier, it extends from the United States abroad as well. So this, if you have a hankering to read The Big Sleep, or maybe you already have read it, I hope that I'm speaking for the three of us, saying that read outwards from Chandler and trace this tree, because it's one of the more interesting of many American literatures. So thanks, everybody.
And I think that's a great way to conclude. Thank you once again to the panelists and to the audience, and I hope everyone has a great afternoon.